So, I have spent the last couple of days trying to film book reviews for each of these three books that I want to talk to you about today. Hopefully, if I can get through this. And since I haven't recorded a book review in over a year, this process was really difficult, and it was just terrible. Since I came back, I've joked a couple of times about being afraid that I've forgotten how to do this, and it turns out I've forgotten how to do this. So rather than try to do one of my long-winded book reviews that I like to do, let's try something different and simplify this both for you and for me today. I'm going to talk about three books that are a little bit under the radar, so to make it a little bit more digestible, a little bit easier on you to decide if these books are right for you, and to make it easier on me so I can only talk about them for like 2 minutes. Rather than do a straight book review about each of these three books, I'm going to do if you like this, then read this. Okay, first book. If you like conversations about conflicting forms of feminism, I would suggest you read My Nemesis by Charmaine Craig. In this book, we meet a woman named Tessa. She's a successful writer who strikes up a friendship and later a quasi-intimate relationship with a philosopher named Charlie. Now, Charlie is married, and he's married to a woman named Wah. Throughout the story, Tessa starts to clash a little more with Wah as she gets to know her and gets to know the dynamic in their family, because Tessa is more of a modern-day feminist, we'll say. She's very outspoken. She stands up for everything that she wants. She's very concerned about actively doing right for womanhood, not accepting any secondary roles, just going for what you want and taking it. Wah, on the other hand, she's of mixed race Asian heritage, and she has a little bit more of a, we'll call it traditional femininity, more subservience to her husband. And Tessa just cannot stand this dynamic. She literally calls her to her face an insult to womankind. So these two forms of femininity, these two forms of feminism clash with each other throughout the book. And Charmaine Craig just does some really interesting things to put this whole conversation in perspective, to pull at some of these threads, to really discuss what is strength, what is weakness. Can strength only be one thing? Can weakness only be one thing? How do each of those words grow and change and shift based on the culture you're from, and what your goals are, and what you want your family dynamic to be? It's a really interesting look at power and jealousy and femininity and envy and seduction and our public lives versus our private lives. It's fascinating, and Charmaine Craig does a really interesting interview. If you're not quite sure whether you want to read the book, go on YouTube and search for her. I think she's a fascinating speaker. She speaks about her own book so well. I think you'll be hooked. I was. Next, if you like books by authors like John Irving or Anne Patchett or Richard Russo or Meg Wolitzer, I would suggest that you read The Road to Dalton by Shannon Bowring. And if you like this, read this. Is the perfect way to review this book, because it's one of those books that's about the interlocking lives of a small town. The inciting incident is a car crash that happens near the end of the 1980s, and just the reverberating ripples of that moment throughout the town over the years. Talking about specifics of this book, I'm afraid to give too much away. That's why I would rather pinpoint authors that are similar to this. If you like books that really speak to the dignity of a mundane life, I think you'd be interested in this. If you like books that are really driven by dialogue, I think you'd be interested in this. If you love the unspoken truths that make a small town, if you know anything about what it's like to live in a small town, those unspoken truths that everybody knows but no one talks about, it's such a huge part of rural life. It's such a huge part of this book. It's funny and it's poignant and it's sweet and it's heartbreaking. It's about family. It's about friendship. It has this really fascinating queer relationship of these two middle-aged women who are involved in separate marriages and who find themselves in the middle of their life and kind of secretly pursue this relationship as they try to figure things out. And it's beautiful. It's Shannon Bowring's first book ever. It was blurbed by Richard Russo. That's the only reason I read it, because I trust him implicitly, because I love him. And it's such a Russo book. And finally, if you are interested in expanding what you consider to be the queer canon, I would recommend that you read Totem Pole by Sanford Friedman. This is a queer coming-of-age story. It was written in the 1960s. And what I find so fascinating about it is that it's not about the two typical type of queer stories that you'll often get. It's not about coming out, and it's not about being in the closet. It's a story about a person's coming out to themselves. And the format is so interesting. It takes the form of a totem pole, which there's piece built on piece, built on piece, built on piece, which each piece stands on its own individually, and it is its own individual artistic thing, but they also build on one another to make one greater structure. And in Totem Pole, the book is told in a series of long, almost like short stories, like 30, 40, 50 page chunks. And each of those stories kind of make up the totem pole of Stephen Wolf's life. Now, Stephen Wolf is a young Jewish boy, and at the start of this story, I think he's 2. And by the end of the story, he's in his 20s, and we go through his time as a young boy, going to camps in the summer, then becoming a theater kid, and then finally growing up and going to war. In every stage of his life, each piece of the totem pole just builds this queer life that Stephen is discovering for himself and not even understanding remotely. The details that Sanford Friedman includes here, you can just see the breadcrumbs occurring. How he's just so obsessed with his camp counselor when he's young, or how he's responding to theater, or when he goes away to war, that kind of intense physical life or death moment that really makes you understand who you are and what you want and how badly you want those things. It's extraordinary, and it's so sad, the thought that this book could very well have been lost to time, and it's just another feather in the cap of NYRB, who constantly finds these books that have just been abandoned over time and finding them and rescuing them and giving them a second life. And Totem Pole is absolutely one of those books that needed to have a second life. This is a crucial, important book in the history of queer literature. I really believe that. Stephen is a man who was taught to hate his body at the protection of his soul. And Totem Pole is essentially a story about him unifying those two things, about him rescuing his soul from the edges of this bleak eternity and finding and building a relationship with his own body that he comes to love. That both of these elements are not only better if they're combined to make one complete person, they're absolutely necessary to be combined to have one complete happy person. This was written in the mid-60s, it was barely published, and then by the mid-80s, it was forgotten, and it was rescued again, and then forgotten again, and now NYRB has finally rescued it, hopefully for good. Don't miss the chance if you're remotely interested in the queer canon, queer literature. Huge, huge, huge recommendation for me. This book is fantastic. So there we go, we got through it. All 3 of those books come so highly recommended from me. As always, thank you so much for watching. This was really fun. My name is Rick, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.